What's up, grinders? It's your favorite communist, right-wing, peace-loving hippie scam artist here to talk about how I study smarter, not harder. Now, we're doing a review of this video, and if you're a little bit confused about that intro, just watch the previous video, you'll get it. Okay, so what I want to do today is I want to look at a video that's not related to languages. However, it's about learning in general, and we're going to look at how we can take what this person's saying and apply it to, our own experience in learning languages, because something that we often do in the language learning community is we basically just look inwards. We don't really look outwards and, dive into different areas of expertise and see how those people approach problems. And overall, generally, there's going to be a lot of overlap, but maybe there's something new that we can pick up along the way, and maybe something will help me bring ideas to the forefront to present to you guys. So we're going to watch this video now. Let's see what happens.
Today we are discussing how to study and learn. That is, what the scientific data say is the best way to study in order to remember information and to be able to use that information effectively in different areas of your life. Most of what we believe about the best ways to study are absolutely false. Fortunately, today you will learn the best ways to study. Now let's talk about how the best students structure their days. There's a really nice paper, in fact, that surveyed close to 700 students. These were medical students, approximately equal number of male and female students, and analyzed the most useful learning habits. There are at least...
Medical students are insane with the amount of stuff that they actually need to study. If you've ever gone on Reddit and you looked at the Anki medical students discussions about how many cards and stuff those guys do, they're popping out. Some of them are doing 1,000 cards a day type of thing. It's insane, the amount of stuff that those guys are trying to cram into their heads. So this is... Obviously, when we look at this, we've got to look at it from the perspective of someone who's doing an insane amount of study.
10 study habits that the highly effective students use. I'm going to focus on the top 5 or 6 because it turns out that most of the effect, it appears, of being a better student can be attributed to these top 5 or 6 habits.
Which makes sense. That's just the 80-20 rule in action.
First of all, they set aside time to study. They literally schedule time to study. Now, this probably serves several roles. The first one is that they are able to clear out other distractions. And in fact, that's the second thing that they do. They are very effective, or they make it a point of putting their phone away and off, of isolating themselves. That's right. They're not studying with other people. They study alone. They put their phone away. They tell their friends and families that they are not going to be able to be reached during that time. Yes, they study for 3 or 4 hours per day, but they break that up into a couple of different sessions.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So basically, this falls in quite nicely with my philosophy of the grind, where you need to, do something with the language every single day. And the idea is that you actually form a habit. And also by doing it daily, yes, you've got the habit, but 2, it makes sure that, you don't fall off the bandwagon type of thing. If you just do a little bit over here and a little bit over there, it can be quite easy that you forget about this whole thing altogether. But if you do something every day, it really establishes that habit, and it also kind of makes it like a focal point of, each day, I've got to do something type of thing. Now, the second thing he mentioned there was distractions. This is an easy one. If you get distracted by your phone or something, just go put it in the kitchen, put it as far away from you as possible. If you've got any apps open, like Discord and stuff, just completely shut them down type of thing. And that's the best way because, to stop yourself getting distracted, all you got to do is make sure the distraction is not present.
It's typically 2 or 3 sessions. So they're not doing a 3 or 4 hour studying bout all in one shot. So they're managing their time. They're eliminating distractions. That is sure to help them anchor their focus and attention. They know that they're going to need to use their focus and attention during that time. Scheduling time where you're going to need to be focused and attending is perhaps one of the most important things toward being able to focus and attend to the material. To the extent...
Okay, there's something I want to talk about here because I guarantee you he's not going to cover it off because pretty much none of these videos do. So they talk about how, you need to set a scheduled time. You set a scheduled time and then every day you do it at that scheduled time, and that creates a habit again. However, the problem that I've often seen and I've encountered myself is that if you make your habit too specific, it becomes very easy then to accidentally break it. Here's an example. If you have a habit of, I'm going to do some language study every day, or I'm going to watch content in the language every day, that is a daily habit. You could do it in the morning, you could do it in the afternoon, it doesn't matter. If something happens during the day, you can move it around. I've seen people in my Discord literally push it to midnight, because they're like, oh, I haven't done it today type of thing. However, if you set a scheduled time as your habit, you say, every day at 6 to 7, I will do my study, you're going to encounter a day very, very quickly where you just can't do it at that time just due to life, okay? Unless you just happen to be one of those people with a very set, rhythm in life type of thing. And what's going to happen is you're going to break that habit very quickly. And as soon as you break a habit, it's like the internal streak in your head is broken. And it can be quite upsetting for a lot of people, including myself. I hate it when I break a habit. And what usually results is that I broke my habit, and then the next day it's just like, there's like a 50% chance I don't do it again, and then it's pretty much, it's gone, it's over by then. Which is why I talk about doing something every day, because that's frequent enough, but it's also, it gives you some leeway. Now, obviously, you can get sick and stuff like that, but even when you're sick, you can kind of lay there in bed just dying while staring at the TV, absorbing of some of the content, because usually when you're sick, that's what you do, unless you're like completely passed out. But you can't avoid those situations. However, if you set a specific time, I guarantee very quickly you will break that habit.
That you have any control over the time in which you're going to study, keeping that at a regular time or times, perhaps 1 block early in the day, 1 block later in the day, perhaps 2.
Now, splitting up, doing your study, it's good in some ways because, yes, you give your brain a little bit of a rest, especially for like a language. You can like let those neurons relax, go do something else, and then when you come back, you've got like a little bit of more energy. However, there's also a downside to breaking up a block of time, and that is basically where it takes you a period of time to get into it, to actually start the process. And to give you guys a good example of this is, as I work as a programmer, and what's very common in the programming world is we will have a concept that's called agile methodology, etc., where you're giving tasks over a period of time and you complete those tasks. But a part of this is that in the morning you'll have all your meetings, you'll get them over and done with, and then everyone leaves the programmers alone to just hyper focus on what they need to do for that day. Because what happens is if you go distract them with some pointless unimportant thing, it breaks their chain of thought. They lose everything that they had in their head, and then it will take them like up to 15 minutes to get back into the flow. And just a couple of distractions is enough to destroy like half a work of productivity. And it's the same with study. If you start splitting up your blocks and your blocks get too small, just remember, like, there's a period of time at the start where it takes you to actually get into the flow of doing things. Now, also, as someone gets better and better at this, they can get into the flow of like in a lot quicker way. Like some people, they can just literally sit down, boom, start straight away. But I'm not that type of person. I need like a little bit of a time frame to, start getting into the flow and actually focusing.
2 blocks early in the day and so on is going to be beneficial. It turns out that's also supported by the research literature. If you regularly, meaning for the course of about 3 days, make it a point to focus and study at particular times, again, pulling your attention back, it's not an automatic process, but pulling your attention back to a specific location, perhaps on a page or that you're listening to in a lecture, your body and brain will start to entrain to that rhythm.
I think this is one of those things where it's like, oh, you got to go to a specific page. I think this really is individual based. Okay, so for example, with me, I'm the type of person when I study something, I don't want to know what I'm going to study. It takes the fun out of it. So when I sit down to do my Chinese grind for the day, I don't know what videos I'm going to watch. I don't know what I'm going to study. I pretty much just start exploring. I just start, maybe I'll watch something because it caught my attention, and then I'll sentence mind that. Or maybe I'll just do some speaking practice because I feel like doing speaking practice. I don't like to set like a certain course, because what happens with me is if I see a course, then I'm going to see how long it takes, and then I'm going to see how far away the end is. And that's just like disheartening to me. And I'm just like, oh, so there's still so much time. But if I just sit down and I kind of just, wander my way through things, I enjoy it a lot more. Now, again, this comes down to the individual. Some people like to see, slow progression over time building towards an end goal. Me, I just kind of like to Miranda my way through things.
Such that you will be able to focus and attend better simply by virtue of the regularity of the timing of the exposure to the material. Okay, so you probably need about 2 or 3 days to break into a regular schedule of focus.
2 or 3 days, I don't think is enough time to break into a habit. Like, I've read habits can take up to 90 days to form. So just keep that in mind, that once you start doing this, it will take quite a while before it just becomes automated.
And attending and studying at a given time. Allow yourself that transition period, but then make it a point to schedule those times to study. Set aside your phone. Tell people you're going offline.
Again, I just want to reiterate, don't get too hung up on like the specific time in the day. Just do it daily.
Turn off the Wi-Fi if you need to or have to. You may need it for your studying. I don't know. Depends on what you're studying. But limit distractions at all costs and learn to just focus on the material. And this is a skill. This is the most important thing to understand. It's a skill to be able to focus and study. And it's a skill that you can learn very quickly, especially if you schedule it for regular times and you give yourself 2 or 3 days in which to adapt to those schedules and times, and then try and stick to them as regularly as possible. Perhaps even on the weekends if you're approaching the end of the quarter or semester. Keeping those regular times will entrain your nervous system to study and learn at its best at those particular times.
So basically everything in there at the end, which I didn't comment on, was just reiterating the previous stuff.
Ever there was a strongly research-supported tool in the literature, in the peer-reviewed literature, about how students can learn information better, it's testing. I know. We think of tests as a way to evaluate our knowledge, but it turns out that testing is one of the best ways to build our knowledge.
So like a testing in a language sense would simply be, okay, I've watched content, now I'm going to try talk about the content. Or I'm in a scenario, I'm going to try talk about this scenario. I'm going to pretend I'm in this scenario, which is why I often say on this channel is that you should approach speaking and listening kind of at the same pace, because it helps fortify one another. So like if you do a lot of listening and you don't do any speaking, you will make progression. However, what will happen is also it will take you longer in some sense. Now, eventually you're going to have to come back and do speaking anyway. So it's like if you hit it from two different ways at once, it's like hitting a muscle group from multiple different directions, you will fortify things overall.
Retain our knowledge, and again, to offset forgetting. The study of testing as a learning tool, not just as a way to evaluate how much information we've learned, goes back over 100 years. There's a classic study that was done
Just for those who didn't quite catch that, so testing is used in two different ways. One, to evaluate your lack of knowledge, that would be like talking and finding holes. And the second one is to strengthen your current pre-existing knowledge, that would be you practicing in order to improve your fluency.
1917, where grade school age children read biographies. So they read biographies, and then the kids were divided into different groups. One group read and reread those biographies over and over. Another group read the biographies once and then were tested on those biographies. But get this, they tested themselves on those biographies simply by having to think about the information that they had read and trying to remember the information. Like, what was the biography? Who was the person? Who were they married to? What did they do? When did they go to school? What did they do in school? What did they do in the world? What role did they play?
Okay, so the equivalent here in the language world would be you've got one group which will sit down and watch the same content over and over and over, and then you have a second group which will watch the content once and then try summarize it using the actual language. So you watch a video and then you try tell some pretend person who doesn't exist what you just watched. Imagine they have never seen it. So what's happening here is you're obviously retrieving knowledge about what you just watched, but also you're now having to explain what you just watched, and you're probably going to use words and phrases that you actually heard in the content. And also there's another thing that I like to do. I've only just started trying it out recently, but I find it quite fun, is where I watch content is you can sometimes enter like this passive phase where you're watching it, you're kind of focused but not too focused, maybe because you're a little bit tired. Just try every now and then repeat certain random phrases you hear just out loud. So they'll say something, you just say it, okay? And what will happen there is your brain will become like a little bit more active or focus in on the content more. And plus, you're repeating, you're basically shadowing, well, not really shadowing, but you're listening and repeating after real phrases that you're hearing
in life. So they essentially tested their own knowledge simply by going into their own head and asking themselves what they could remember about those biographies. Now, keep in mind here that even though it's fairly apparent that reading a biography 2, 3, 4 times might seem more passive than testing oneself on a biography that they had read just once, right? You could imagine that thinking about the biography involves more effort, and indeed it does. But keep in mind also that kids in the second group were only exposed to the biography once. And yet, when you look at the percent of accurate recall of information from those biographies, the children that read the biography once and then made a deliberate point to think about that biography in their own mind to effectively test themselves on that material just within their heads over and over, vastly outperformed the kids that read the biographies over and over. Put different.
So basically here, this would be the language equivalent of you're hearing set phrases through these TV shows and you're basically repeating them back. By repeating them back, especially if you do it after you've watched the content and you talk about what you heard, you're going to get stuck in different ways. What did they say? They said something along these lines. Maybe I'll go back and rewatch that part type of thing. But you're strengthening your knowledge of the language through your speaking capabilities, and obviously speaking and listening are two different skill sets.
Reading and rereading material and rereading material is far less effective than reading material and then thinking about that material, testing yourself on that material, forcing yourself to bring that
testing yourself on that material is basically what we're doing here with speaking about it.
Material to mind in your own mind. And this is not just for sake of remembering more volume of material, but also accuracy of recall of that material.
Here's a good example. This was a discussion that happened in the Discord. So one of my subs in the Discord, he said, you know, I've watched this content. I understood it. I had no issues understanding it. But then when I stopped and I went back and I looked at the subtitles, I actually found that there were a ton of words that I didn't actually even really recognize that were there. Maybe like I didn't understand, but weren't important to the context. You know, when you start like hyper analyzing it and going in and doing sentence mining and stuff like that, that's where you find all those things that you've been skipping, and your brain keeps skipping because it feels like it's just not relevant to its life. So sometimes you need to force to your brain to let it know, like, look, I know you want to keep skipping this because it's not a major part of the language, but you need to learn it, okay? Just to get your own fluency levels up. Because the brain is a very lazy thing. It will find the information it needs and it will skip everything else until it is forced to like pick up the rest of that stuff.
The more times you test yourself or that you are tested on material, the better your retention of that material. Now, some people will immediately say, well, goodness, what if I learned it and then I'm tested and I'm somehow consolidating the wrong or inaccurate material? But it doesn't.
So this would be in the language sense. What happens if I start talking and I make mistakes, you know, I'm doing errors? Well, the great thing about language is that your brain, after it gets enough content, enough input, it starts to recognize what is authentic patterns and what are, you know, wrong patterns, basically. And everyone's done this who's learned a language, where they'll say something and they'll realize they made a mistake after they've said it. And like, then they'll get corrected and they'll like, yeah, I know I made a mistake there. I'm well aware of that. I'm working on that, because they just haven't practiced that enough, but they're able to hear their own mistakes. So the important thing here is you're able to recognize your own mistakes. If you can recognize your own mistakes, it means you can improve upon them.
Doesn't appear to be the case. As long as you learn what the correct answers to the tests are, even if
Exactly. As long as you learn the correct answers.
you're getting, 40 or 50% or less accurate on those tests that you take immediately after the studying period.
Okay, now something I've mentioned quite a bit on this channel is fossilization. Now, fossilization has this like internal idea that you're going to make a mistake and it's going to be with you forever. No matter the mistake that you make, you can eventually be trained out of it. An example being is, and this is not a mistake, is that I had a very country Australian accent when I was young, all the way up until my 20s. But then I went to acting school and I retrained in my accent to have a more standardized Australian accent, because that's expected if I was ever to go into the film industry. And it's now at the point where I can't actually go back and do my country Australian accent anymore. I literally can't pull it off. Like, my brain has just accepted that that was wrong and that this is right.
Period. That's still going to be a better strategy than rereading the material, which ought to be somewhat surprising. It certainly was surprising to me. But you know what's even more surprising and a little scary, and that we all should know, and I wish I had learned when I was like in the second grade, is that if you ask students, how confident are you in the material that you just learned? The students who study the material, that is, who were exposed to the material 4 times, think that they are going to perform best on the...
Okay, so this is probably going to annoy a few people, but if you're doing the pure input approach, this is something that happens. So some people will go down the pure input path and they will understand the language enough to be able to engage in conversations and stuff like that, eventually type of thing. And they'll think that their language level is actually really high when it's actually not that high, like in comparison to someone else who has done both input and active study and has gotten to a similar level. Because what happens is you get used to understanding what's being said and then glossing over everything else that you just didn't hear because it was not relevant to you in that moment. Now, with enough input and enough time, eventually you'll get the whole lot. But there's definitely a very large phase where you just get very good at jumping from the key points to the key points and skipping everything in the middle, and it stays there skipped for a very, very, very long time. So I will see this when I enter into discussions with people who are like proponents of just pure input. And I've noticed it myself. Like when I watch pure Spanish content now, I'm like 25 hours into Dreaming Spanish. I'm watching that and I'm going, wow, I've understand so much. This is great. But if I pause it and I look up each of these words, there's tons of stuff that I'm not actually understanding. Because another component to this is that 80% of human communication is actually visual. Like when you're talking with people, when you're watching content, it's based on the feedback of the body. So people forget that they actually get a massive amount of the comprehensibility from literally just the visualization of the body, as opposed to actually the language. And it takes you a while to get to that point where you can actually hear everything. However, if you actively study and get those little bits down, you will hear it a lot faster.
Ultimate exam. However, the students that study the material once and then are tested 3 times on that material, they think that ultimately they're going to perform least well.
And I totally get that as well, because if you pause a video and you break down every single sentence, every subtitle, let's say, in a 30-minute video, I guarantee by the end of that, you're going to be like, God damn, my language capabilities are shite. because you actually see how much you don't understand. Like, it's in broad daylight there for you. However, I could sit down and watch a gaming video from beginning to end in Chinese, and I'm like, yeah, man, I fully understood that. But if I pause that video on every single subtitle and read it, I guarantee you there's a lot that I'm missing.
And guess what? The exact opposite is true. Put differently, when you're exposed to material over and over and over again, you think you've learned the material. In fact, your confidence that you've learned the material increases with each subsequent exposure to the material. But actually, you haven't learned it at all compared to the people that are exposed to the material and then take tests on the material, oftentimes straining to get the answer.
Now, it's the same thing. If you just read that material over and over and over and over, and you did hours of reading it over every day, eventually you will learn it. Like, it's guaranteed. But why do that when you can just read the material, then test yourself on it, and, even look at it, go down, break it apart, sentence mine it? Because then, once you've done that, you've actually got a much better understanding of it, and you can move on to the next piece. And all that understanding that you got will apply to future pieces as well.
Answers right on those tests. In fact, sometimes getting those answers dead wrong and then realizing they get those answers dead wrong, or sometimes they just sense it. But guess what? Testing yourself once, twice, maybe 3 times prior to the ultimate test of your knowledge of that material is far and away the best way to lock that material into those neural circuits. The other thing that they do, and this is very important, is that they make an effort to then teach their peers, to teach other students in the class. Now, some of you may be thinking that if you spend all this time learning the information and you are in a competitive scenario with the other students.
Okay, the competitive thing's not like an issue of language learning, obviously, although some people, they definitely treat it in a competitive way. However, I want to talk about the teaching, because I made the most progress probably with my Esperanto when I was running classes for a couple of years. Like, every weekend I was teaching the language, and I got the most random of questions, and there was so much stuff that I did not actually know until I started teaching that I thought I knew. And then when I'd go look it up, I'd find all the answers to, why is it exactly like this in this situation, as opposed to just having accepted it up to this point. After teaching, doing this for 2 years, I could answer all of these questions now. I knew exactly why it was that way. So teaching is definitely a great way of actually improving your abilities. But obviously, this is something you should do when you're basically fluent, because you're not going to do this in the early stages of a language.
That teaching them the information is kind of a freebie for them and it's harder for you, meaning you're putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage.
Although you could teach an invisible person, you could pretend to teach someone, and that will help you find even problems in your spoken language.
Or you're giving them an unfair advantage for not having done the work. It's very clear that students who make it a point to learn material in isolation, then bring that material to other students in the same course and teach them, perform exceedingly well in comparison to the other students.
He's talking about competition here, and this is making me think about the language community as a whole. One thing I've noticed is that people seem to give more respect to people who have learnt a bunch of languages to an okay level, as opposed to someone who's learnt one language to an insane level. And to me, it's basically the same thing. Hours per hours wise, that person may have spent, 10, 20 years on that one language, got really, really good at it, but they will receive less respect to, say, this person over here who's learned 6 languages to an okay level type of thing. So I don't know where that comes from, and obviously if you've been learning languages or you've been in the community long enough, maybe that doesn't affect you, but it's definitely something that I see among newbies who are like, oh wow, that guy speaks 6 languages, he's so much better than this person over here, they only speak 1 language, especially when they talk about comparing things.
So don't be afraid to be a teacher of your peers in order to test, this is key, to test and develop mastery of the material. Now, there are other components to learning and neuroplasticity that I've talked about on previous podcasts that are just too interesting not to mention, but I'm just going to mention them in brief. Things like gap effects. Gap effects are oh so cool, and they've been demonstrated for lots of different forms of learning. Gap effects are what I just did, which is to take periodic pauses in the learning of material as short as 5 to 10 seconds, but even as long as 30 seconds, during which, guess what, your hippocampus, the neurons in your hippocampus, repeat information that you've been exposed to for the first time at a rate 20 to 30 times faster, just as it does during rapid eye movement sleep. So if you are a teacher and or if you are a learner, periodically throughout an episode, a class, or whatever, of trying to learn new motor skills or music skills or whatever kind of learning, pause and let your hippocampus generate more repetitions of that material than it would otherwise if you just tried to barrel through.
With actual content, that might be hard. However, I could see that working with Anki. Maybe after you do a card, just stop and think about it type of thing. Although that would pull out the time it takes. I'm not sure what the benefit, how much of a benefit this is.
There's one other point that I wanted to pass along from this really nice study on the study habits of highly effective medical students, and that is when one examined, or these people were asked about their motivation for studying, the best performing students had an interesting answer. They had a very long-term understanding of how, or belief rather, about how their success in medical school would impact their family, how it would impact their life arc, how it would change them. And they weren't particular about the ways in which it would change them or their family. In fact, it was a rather broad, abstract, aspirational way of...
Yeah, have it like an insane goal, you know, basically something that will affect you in some really interesting way. Mine is eventually I want to do a Let's Play channel in Chinese.
Thinking about their study efforts. So the high-level aspirational stuff within you, whatever that is for you, it's going to be highly individual, is certainly important, and it offers a bookend to the nuts and boltsy kind of stuff that you're going to do, I would hope, in order to best study and learn the specific material, so the specific actions that you're going to take each day to learn specific bits of information that will pull you toward those important aspirations.
Okay, so I finished that video, but I wasn't happy leaving, you know, just that gap effect right at the end there, like, unanswered, because to me, of everything I learned in that video, that was probably the most interesting point and something I hadn't heard about before. So I did some searching around and I found this video. It's about 1.5 minutes, so let's watch it together.
When you learn something, whether or not it's a physical skill or you're learning a language, let's say you're working on sentences in Spanish, because you're learning Spanish, as we know, and you're really drilling it harder, you're working at it. Turns out that if you stop randomly every once in a while and take 10 seconds and just do nothing, the brain, this has been now demonstrated by brain imaging, the brain runs many repetitions inside of that little rest block of the material that you were trying to learn. And the speed of learning and the depth of learning is much faster. So these gap effects have been shown for physical skill learning, language learning, math learning, music, etc. And this is the same process that happens during sleep. So normally you learn something during the day, or you try and learn, you go to sleep, and during sleep there's a rapid replay of the information.
Right. Which is obviously, you know, why we have dreams related to what we've learnt during the day or things that have happened. But anyway, this here is a really interesting phenomenon to me, if it's actually true. So let's think about the ways that we could possibly utilize this depending on different methodologies. So obviously if you're using Anki, the easiest way to do this would be like as you're going through cards, just randomly stop, lay back for 10 seconds, maybe think about it. Maybe he didn't even say you had to think about it. He said it's just like it's an automatic process that happens. So just take a 10-second break and then just go back at it again type of thing. I guess if you're watching input, maybe just watching like some content, you know, pause it for 10 seconds, just stare at it for a little bit and then just keep going type of thing. If you're reading, maybe at the end of the page, you know, or halfway through the page, just take a short break. But I'm actually going to, you know, implement this as part of my study routine and see if it like actually feels like it makes any difference in any way. Obviously, if the difference is so small that it's not really like noticeable, then I can't really give you guys any feedback on it. But I feel like it's something interesting that I'm going to try out, and maybe it's something you guys want to try out. And then in a future video, I'll probably give you my thoughts on, like, you know, how it's impacted me, if it's impacted me at all. So maybe you guys want to try it in the meantime, and we can all, like, give our thoughts down the road.
And that's when so-called neuroplasticity, rewiring of connections, occurs. These little gaps that you're doing, that you're inserting at random, not every 3 minutes or so, but just at random, taking these 10-second gaps,
yeah,
give you many more repetitions. So it's if ever there was a little, was it like a cheat code? Is that what they called in video games? I don't play video games, but a cheat code, it's this, that every once in a while you just stop and do nothing. You don't have to close your eyes, and you're getting more repetitions, and then you go back into it.
Okay, so basically just randomly take small breaks, 10 seconds, don't even think about it, maybe close your eyes as he said, and then just continue on. It's not something hard to insert into a study like rhythm, so I'm going to try it out. And that's pretty much it. If you guys have liked this video and you want to see more videos where I review other people, just drop a link to whatever video you want me to review in the comment section below, and I might end up reviewing it. And of course, join the Discord if you haven't already. And I'll see you all in the next video. And if you're not there, well, the very next time you close your eyes to take that gap, you may open them to see me staring at you.